The crystalline spires of the Intergalactic Academy of Higher Learning pierce the rose-gold sky of New Earth like frozen lightning. Professor ZYX 427, the most renowned educator from the Centauri Collective, moved through the halls with fluid grace, their bioluminescent form casting shifting patterns on the polished walls. This was to be their greatest challenge yet, testing the limits of consciousness itself through what they called the impossible riddle. The Grand Lecture Hall buzzed with activity as students from over 300 species filled the chamber. Some floated in anti-gravity pods, others merged with their neural interface chairs, while a few existed as pure energy within containment fields. Among them sat the handful of human students, looking decidedly ordinary in their standard uniforms. Professor ZYX 427 had spent millennia perfecting this riddle, one that tested not just intelligence, but the fundamental nature of consciousness and reality itself. Every advanced civilization had failed to solve it, their greatest minds stumbling over its seemingly simple yet impossibly complex nature. The professor had chosen this moment, this gathering of the brightest young minds in the galaxy, to present it one final time. Greetings, young minds. ZYX 427's thoughts resonated directly in their students' consciousness, translated perfectly into each species' native understanding. Today marks a historic moment in our Universal Academy. I present to you a challenge that has stumped the greatest thinkers across 12 galaxies. The air crackled with anticipation as holographic displays materialized around each student. The professor continued, their form pulsing with patterns of deep purple and gold. This riddle has remained unsolved for over 10,000 years. It has driven quantum supercomputers into recursive loops. It has caused artificial superintelligences to voluntarily shut down rather than face its implications. Warning symbols flashed across various species' neural interfaces as anxiety levels spiked. The professor's next words sent ripples of excitement and fear through the assembled students. Those who wish to attempt the riddle must sign a waiver acknowledging the potential risk to their fundamental understanding of reality. Those who accept this challenge will have one standard galactic month to submit their solution. In the back row, Sarah Chin, a second-year human student specializing in xenolinguistics, felt her heart race. Unlike her technologically augmented classmates, she had nothing but her natural human intelligence and intuition to rely on. Yet something about the professor's words sparked a familiar feeling, the same one she got when looking at optical illusions or contemplating paradoxes. As the professor prepared to reveal the riddle, the Academy's AI systems began implementing additional security protocols. The last time this riddle had been presented, 3 civilizations had declared war on each other over conflicting interpretation methods. The stakes were astronomical, but no one could have predicted that the solution would come from the most unexpected source imaginable. The holographic displays synchronized, and the riddle began to take form before their eyes. The chamber fell into absolute silence as Professor ZYX 427 spoke the words that would change the course of galactic history. Before you lies the question that defines consciousness itself. May your minds be ready for what follows. The holographic displays shimmered as Professor ZYX 427's riddle materialized before the assembled students. It appeared differently to each species, translated into forms their minds could comprehend, yet its essence remained constant, a perfect paradox wrapped in an impossible question. When the unmade creates the unreal, and the observer ceases to observe, what remains in the space between thought and existence? The professor's consciousness voice resonated through the chamber. You must not only answer what remains, but explain why your answer transcends the boundaries of known physics and metaphysics. The chamber erupted in a cacophony of neural activity. The crystalline Arcturians began spinning complex mathematical models in the air around them. The quantum-linked hive mind of the Vesperians split into a trillion parallel thought processes. The cybernetically enhanced Proximan students instantly connected to their race's vast knowledge networks. Sarah Chin sat quietly, her pencil hovering over an actual paper notebook, an archaic tool that drew curious glances from her alien classmates. While others rushed to apply advanced computational models and quantum algorithms, she found herself drawn to the peculiar wording of the riddle itself. Days turned into weeks. The Academy's halls filled with increasingly desperate students. The Arcturians' mathematical models had grown so complex they began to develop their own gravity wells. The Vesperian hive mind had already lost 3,000 subprocesses to recursive loops. Even the mighty Proximan networks were showing signs of strain. Professor ZYX 427 watched it all with growing fascination. They had seen this pattern before: the initial confidence, the mounting frustration, the desperate application of ever more complex solutions. But something was different this time. The human student, Sarah Chin, hadn't submitted a single formal query to the Academy's databases. Instead, she spent hours in the botanical gardens, seemingly doing nothing but watching the metamorphosis of alien butterflies. 3 weeks into the challenge, the first casualties began. The Arcturians' highest probability mathematician suffered a complete crystal matrix collapse after attempting to solve the riddle through 11-dimensional calculus. 2 Proximan students had to have their neural implants completely reset after their logic engines encountered unsolvable contradictions. Yet Sarah Chun continued her peculiar routine. Each day, she would attend lectures, spend time in the gardens, and make small notes in her paper notebook. Her calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the growing chaos around her. "You appear uncommonly peaceful, young human," Professor ZYX 427 observed one evening, approaching Sarah in the gardens. "Have you given up on solving the riddle?" Sarah looked up from her notebook, a slight smile playing at her lips. "Not at all, Professor. I'm just approaching it differently." "Oh!" The professor's form shimmered with curiosity. "And how does watching butterflies help solve a metaphysical paradox?" "Sometimes," Sarah replied, watching an iridescent creature emerge from its chrysalis, "the answer isn't in what we know, but in what we're willing to unlearn." The professor's luminescence flickered, a sign of surprise in their species. In all their millennia of teaching, they had never heard such a response to their riddle. Before they could inquire further, Sarah stood up, brushed off her uniform, and headed toward the Academy's main hall. "Professor," she called back over her shoulder, "I think I'm ready to submit my answer." The news spread through the Academy like a quantum wave collapse. Students abandoned their calculations and simulations, rushing to the grand lecture hall. The Proximan networks hummed with activity as they prepared to analyze what they assumed would be another failed attempt. The Vesperians reconnected their scattered thought processes, curious about what this simple human could possibly offer. As Sarah Chin walked to the center of the hall, Professor ZYX 427 felt something they hadn't experienced in thousands of years: genuine uncertainty about what was about to happen. The Grand Lecture Hall had never been so still. 300 species, representing the pinnacle of galactic civilization, watched as Sarah Chin stood before them, holding nothing but her worn paper notebook. The advanced sensor arrays and quantum computers that usually hummed throughout the chamber had been silenced, their operators curious to witness this human's approach without technological interference. Professor ZYX 427's bioluminescent form shifted through shades of deep indigo, a color reserved for moments of profound academic significance. "Sarah Chun of Earth," their consciousness voice resonated, "you believe you have solved the unsolvable?" "No, Professor," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "I believe I understand why it's not meant to be solved in the way we've all been trying." A ripple of neural chatter swept through the audience. The Arcturians' crystalline forms vibrated with barely contained skepticism. The Proximan students exchanged knowing glances, their cybernetic implants already calculating the probability of another failure. "Please explain," the professor encouraged, their form now pulsing with an unusual pattern that suggested intense curiosity. Sarah opened her notebook, though she barely glanced at it as she spoke. "For 3 weeks, I watched everyone approach this riddle as a problem to be solved through computation, logic, or metaphysical analysis. But while sitting in the gardens, I noticed something about the alien butterflies." She gestured to the holographic display, where the riddle still shimmered. When the unmade creates the unreal, and the observer ceases to observe, what remains in the space between thought and existence? During metamorphosis, Sarah continued, the butterfly literally breaks down into organic soup inside its chrysalis. It ceases to be what it was, yet somehow contains everything it will become. In that moment, it exists in a state that defies simple categorization, neither caterpillar nor butterfly, both unmade and in the process of making. The chamber grew even quieter. Professor ZYX 427's luminescence had become absolutely still, a rare sight that drew gasps from those familiar with their species. The riddle isn't asking us to solve anything, Sarah explained. It's asking us to recognize the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. When we try to observe and categorize it, we're already failing because we're trying to make concrete something that exists precisely in the space between definition. She turned to face her fellow students. Every advanced civilization has tried to solve this with increasingly complex solutions. But complexity isn't clarity. The answer isn't in adding more layers of analysis, it's in recognizing that the question itself is a mirror, showing us how our very attempt to understand consciousness through rigid framework paradoxically takes us further from understanding it. The Vesperian hive mind's trillion parallel thoughts suddenly synchronized into a single, stunned silence. The Proximan networks began registering unprecedented patterns of neural activity. The Arcturians' crystalline forms had stopped their constant mathematical calculations for the first time in recorded history. The space between thought and existence, Sarah concluded, isn't empty at all. It's where consciousness truly lives, not as a problem to be solved, but as a paradox to be experienced. The answer isn't an answer at all. It's the recognition that our need to find an answer is what blinds us to the truth. Professor ZYX 427's form suddenly blazed with a light so brilliant it threatened to overload the chamber's optical sensors. When they spoke, their consciousness voice carried an emotion that the translation matrices struggled to convey. In 10,000 years, they began. In 10,000 years, Professor ZYX 427 continued, their form still radiating with unprecedented brilliance. No one has ever approached the riddle this way. We have watched civilizations tear themselves apart trying to compute the incomputable, to define the indefinable. Yet here, with nothing but observation and intuition, you have grasped its true essence. The chamber erupted into chaos. The Arcturians began a rapid-fire series of crystalline communications, their mathematical models shattering and reforming as they processed this new perspective. The Proximan students' neural networks were overloading as they attempted to reconcile their rigid logical frameworks with Sarah's fluid interpretation. The Vesperian hive mind, in an unprecedented move, split itself into individual consciousness units, each wanting to experience this revelation from a unique perspective rather than their usual unified awareness. The impact of Sarah's insight was literally reshaping how some species thought. But it's so simple, one of the Proximan students finally spoke, their voice carrying both frustration and wonder. How did we not see it? Sarah turned to address her fellow student, her expression gentle. Sometimes the hardest things to see are the ones right in front of us. Every species here has evolved incredible ways of understanding the universe, computational, mathematical, quantum. But in our rush to complicate, we often lose sight of the fundamental truths that don't require computation. Professor ZYX 427 moved to the center of the chamber, their form now pulsing with patterns that the Academy's historians would spend years trying to decode. What we are witnessing, they announced, is more than just the solution to a riddle. It is a demonstration of why the galaxy needs human perspective. The professor's form expanded, filling the chamber with shifting lights as they continued. Your species is young. You lack the computational abilities of the Proximans, the quantum awareness of the Vesperians, the mathematical purity of the Arcturians. Yet you possess something that no amount of technological advancement can replicate, the ability to embrace paradox without trying to resolve it. Sarah's notebook slipped from her hands, falling open to pages filled with sketches of butterflies and scattered notes about transformation. A nearby Arcturian student, their crystalline form still vibrating with excitement, used a precision gravity beam to lift it back to her. "Look at this," the Arcturian exclaimed, their translation matrix struggling to convey their excitement. While we were building quantum supercomputers, she was drawing insects. It's beautiful, completed a Vesperian consciousness node. The simplicity is beautiful, Professor ZYX 427's next words would be recorded in every major galactic archive. The riddle was never about finding an answer. It was about understanding why some questions are more valuable without answers. This is humanity's gift to the galaxy, the ability to embrace mystery as enthusiastically as we embrace knowledge. In the days that followed Sarah's revelation, the Intergalactic Academy underwent a transformation unlike anything in its million-year history. The rigid hierarchies of academic achievement, long dominated by species with superior computational abilities, began to shift. The simple paper notebook became a symbol of revolutionary thinking, with students of all species beginning to experiment with primitive methods of observation and reflection. The Proximan Academic Council, which had long mandated neural implants for all students, was in upheaval. Perhaps, their chief administrator announced during an emergency session, "We have been augmenting the wrong aspects of consciousness. The human ability to embrace uncertainty. This is something our quantum processors cannot replicate." The Vesperian hive mind made an even more dramatic decision. For the first time in their species' history, they began encouraging individual nodes to maintain separate consciousness streams rather than instantly merging all experiences into their collective awareness. "We must learn to see through many eyes," they declared, "not just many processors." Professor ZYX 427 found themselves at the center of a philosophical revolution. The riddle that had been their life's work had transformed from a test of intellectual might into a lesson in intellectual humility. Their lectures, once focused on complex theoretical frameworks, now included long periods of silent observation and contemplation. Sarah Chin, meanwhile, had become something of a reluctant celebrity. Species from across the galaxy sought her insight, not for her computational abilities or technical knowledge, but for her seemingly innate human capacity to find profound meaning in simple observation. "But I didn't do anything special," she insisted during a gathering of the Academy's highest scholars. "I just watched butterflies." "Precisely," Professor ZYX 427 responded, their form shimmering with what had become known as the human appreciation pattern. "You observed without the need to immediately analyze or categorize. You allowed understanding to emerge naturally, without forcing it through artificial frameworks." The Arcturian high mathematician, their crystalline form still adapting to these new concepts, posed a question that had been puzzling many. But how can we apply this approach to our other great challenges? Surely not all problems can be solved by watching insects. Sarah smiled. "The butterflies weren't the solution. They were just what helped me understand. The real insight is that sometimes we need to step back from our assumptions about how to find answers. Every species here has achieved incredible things through their unique abilities. But perhaps the next great leap forward isn't about adding more complexity. Perhaps it's about rediscovering the power of simple observation and intuition." One galactic year after Sarah Chen's revolutionary insight, the Intergalactic Academy of Higher Learning held a ceremony unlike any in its history. The Grand Lecture Hall, once dominated by quantum processors and neural interfaces, had been transformed. Among the advanced technology now stood terrariums containing butterflies from 1,000 worlds, each undergoing their own unique forms of metamorphosis. Professor ZYX 427, their luminescent form now permanently carrying traces of what scholars called the wisdom pattern, addressed the assembled representatives from across the galaxy. "We stand at a turning point in universal education. For eons, we measured advancement by the complexity of our solutions. Today, we celebrate the profound power of simple understanding." The impact of Sarah's approach had spread far beyond academia. The Proximan Engineering Corps, renowned for their hyperlogical approach to spaceship design, had begun incorporating what they called human intuitive architecture into their vessels. Their latest ships featured observation decks and meditation spaces alongside their quantum drives. The Arcturians, whose society had been built on pure mathematical principles, were experiencing a cultural renaissance. Their crystal cities, once precise geometric formations, now incorporated organic patterns inspired by natural growth and transformation. "We have discovered that beauty exists in imperfection," their High Council declared, "and wisdom in uncertainty." Perhaps most surprisingly, the Vesperian hive mind had evolved in unprecedented ways. Individual nodes now regularly disconnected from the collective to experience personal moments of discovery before sharing their insights. Through human eyes, they announced, "We have learned that unity is strengthened by embracing diversity of thought." Sarah Chin, who had since become the Academy's youngest professor, stood before the gathered assembly. Her paper notebook, now preserved in a quantum stasis field, had become a symbol of the revolution she had unknowingly started. But it was her next words that would be remembered for generations. "The greatest discoveries don't always come from solving problems," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. "Sometimes they come from realizing that what we thought was a problem was actually an invitation to see the universe in a new way. Every species here has incredible gifts to offer. The Proximans' logic, the Arcturians' mathematical insight, the Vesperians' collective consciousness, these are all essential parts of our universal community." She gestured to a nearby terrarium, where a butterfly was emerging from its chrysalis. "But perhaps our greatest strength lies not in our individual abilities, but in our willingness to learn from each other. The riddle taught us that consciousness itself exists in the space between certainty and uncertainty. Maybe that's where all great discoveries lie, in the courage to embrace mystery while seeking understanding." Professor ZYX 427 moved to stand beside her, their form radiating with pride. "You have taught us more than the answer to a riddle," they said. "You have shown us that the next great leap in galactic civilization may not come from advancing our technology, but from rediscovering our capacity for wonder." As the ceremony concluded, representatives from 1,000 worlds watched in awe as butterflies from across the galaxy took flight within the chamber, their wings creating patterns of light that seemed to dance with Professor ZYX 427's bioluminescence. It was a moment that symbolized everything they had learned: beauty in simplicity, wisdom in observation, and the profound understanding that sometimes the greatest revelations come not from solving mysteries, but from learning to appreciate them. In the years that followed, the story of the human who solved the unsolvable riddle by watching butterflies became legend. But its true legacy lived on in the transformed approach to knowledge and understanding that spread across the galaxy. Humanity had given the universe not just an answer, but a new way of seeing questions themselves. And in the gardens of the Academy, where it all began, students of all species could often be found sitting quietly, watching butterflies emerge from their chrysalises, learning that sometimes the most profound truths are the ones that can't be calculated. They can only be observed, experienced, and understood with an open heart and a willing mind.